Well, welcome everybody to this very important interview. I'm honored here today to be sitting with the president of the Canadian Peace Congress, Mr. Larry Wasslen. Larry, welcome to Regina. We're really happy to have you here. I hope your trip was peaceful and a success so far.
Well, yes. I'm actually very excited to be in Regina. And Saskatchewan, because I was more than just in Regina, but, the Canadian Peace Congress is looking to build the anti-imperialist peace movement right across the country. And Regina, the Regina Peace Council, is really the peace council that has kept the Canadian Peace Congress going for the longest time. And so really, Regina is a really important stop in this cross-country tour.
That's wonderful. Did you come straight to Regina, or did you have you did a cross-country tour there?
Well, I started in Newfoundland with 2 stops. First in St. John's, where we have a peace council, and then I took the bus across the island, which is like a 12-hour bus ride. And I stopped in Corner Brook, which is a small community of about 20 to 30,000 people, where they did not have a peace council. But after our meeting there, the Corner Brook people decided to form a peace council. So now we have 2 in Newfoundland. And then the Canadian Peace Congress does not organize in Quebec because of the national question. And we work very closely with the Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix, which is an anti-imperialist peace organization in Quebec. So we don't organize there, but we work with them. So we didn't stop in Quebec, but did go on a tour of some places in Ontario, stopped in Kingston, Toronto, and then we went down to Windsor, where, again, they didn't have a peace council in Windsor. But during the meeting there, which was, they had roughly 40 people there, 38 maybe, to be more precise. And during that meeting, they decided to form a peace council there. So, we're encouraged. We're encouraged.
It's been a fruitful trip.
Then I stopped in Winnipeg, had a very good meeting there with Peace Alliance Winnipeg. And now we're in Regina, and later on, this coming week, I'll be in Edmonton, possibly Calgary, and Vancouver, and 4 or 5 places in British Columbia.
Okay, that's wonderful. Can you how long have you been involved with the Canadian Peace Congress, Larry, or the Canadian Peace Movement in general?
Well, the Canadian Peace Movement, I've been involved since Vietnam, so that goes back to the late 60s, early 70s. So that's what first got me into the peace movement. But I was also very involved in the labor movement. So I have these 2 areas of interest. In terms of the labor movement, I was the person that got the first union established in a children's hospital in Ontario. That was in the early 80s, and I was involved in the labor movement and the peace movement from those times. In terms of the Canadian Peace Congress, in 2016 I'm not sure exact date, but anyway, we founded the Ottawa Peace Council, which affiliated to the Canadian Peace Congress. And then in around 2021 or so, I was elected as vice president of the Canadian Peace Congress, and in 2023, I was elected president.
Wonderful. So you have a governance platform also within the Peace Council and the Peace Congress for election and so on.
Yeah, the Peace Congress has a convention every 3 years, and the convention defines what the Peace Congress will do for the next 3 years. So at our last convention, we amended our constitution to be a little more flexible. I don't know if you want details about that, but one of the things that we had done in the past was elect the executive at the convention. But we decided that that didn't provide enough leeway for new peace councils to be involved on the executive. So we left we left it up to the local peace councils to elect the person that they want to be on the Canadian Peace Congress executive. So now whenever a new Congress chapter is created, they will automatically elect a person to be on the executive. So we have a larger executive now, which is more in tune to the local peace actions. And that allows for the Congress to be better informed, and it allows for the Congress to make suggestions for local peace councils on whether or not they want to do X, Y, or Z.
Okay, wonderful. I have a question that you mentioned. It seems that the labor movement, and it seems that when we're talking about peace coalitions, there's the anti-imperialist sentiment in there. Do you mind helping me understand the relationship between why anti-imperialist seems to be in the heart of any peace coalition that ever exists? And it seems also the labor movement, or the movement of the people in one way or another, is also related to that?
Well, in terms of just a little bit of a history of the Canadian Peace Congress. So the Canadian Peace Congress was founded in 1949 at the same time that the World Peace Council was created. So the international body that the Canadian Peace Congress belongs to is the World Peace Council, which was also created in 1949. So if you cast your memories back, or if you look into that history, 1949 was just after the end of the Second World War. 26 or 8 million people had just been killed, and the world wanted peace. This was on everybody's mind. Nobody wanted to go through that again. And so the World Peace Council was formed, the Canadian Peace Congress was formed, and the Canadian Peace Congress is the second oldest peace organization in the country. The oldest one is the Mennonite Central Committee, which was founded in 1920. Now, between I'm going to say 30 and 1940, there was another peace organization, and it was really focused on peace and opposition to fascism, because fascism was growing really violently in those days. So it combined the struggle for peace with the struggle against fascism. But that organization dissolved itself, in the 1940s or so, late 30s or early 40s. And the Canadian Peace Congress came into existence in 1949. So, So in terms of anti-imperialism is the sort of cornerstone of the Canadian Peace Congress, but it is not universal in the peace movement. Mm-hmm. So there are different organizations in the peace movement that are, for example, more pacifist. Some of the religious organizations like the Quakers or the Mennonites are pacifist type organizations. And there are other very I would say kind of like weird peace organizations. Some, for example, advocate trying to convince NATO to be nicer. So there are actually some, organizations that pretend to be peace organizations, but they're really pro-NATO organizations trying to influence the peace movement. Mm-hmm. So I'm leery about actually calling them peace organizations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a few questions that come to mind, but I wanna take into consideration the people that, especially also younger generation, because there is a major generational gap going on in terms of education, and it seems that it just keeps deepening where technology connects us, but at the same time there's so much information, it's very difficult to identify meaningful information in that sense. Imperialism is not necessarily Western, right? Imperialism is kind of a concept that is international, right? Can you just help us understand what imperialism actually kind of is?
Well, there are a number of different definitions of this concept, but it's really born out of the capitalist system, and the fact that capital cannot be confined to one country. And as capital expands within a certain country, it reaches a certain limit, and then it exports capital overseas, and there's then a sort of an aggressive effort to control markets or control natural resources. So imperialism comes out of capitalism, and it then spreads. I mean, you can look back to some of the major theorists on this, and you'll get a really clear picture of it. But capitalism is sort of the economic foundation of imperialism.
Is it related to the sentiment of what empire would mean also?
Well,
imperialism,
yes,
empire, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's so many examples of that, but there are empires that existed before capitalism.
That's right. So that's why
right?
I'm asking that question.
There's the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
There was no capitalism at the time, but there have been empires.
Mm-hmm. Or there was capitalism, but not in a sense that is defined modernly, right? Or what we refer to as capitalism.
Well,
today,
not
maybe.
what we refer to as capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, there was feudalism. Mm-hmm. There were empires based on more or less feudal type of relationships, where the land was owned by big royal families or whatever, and there were all kinds of peasants working for them. But in terms of industrial capitalism, that came out of the 16th and 17th century. And
so, can we make the suggestion? Let's say some of the spiritual movements or the religious movements would say there is a problem in the concept of segregation of power in one way or another. So segregating power and materialism, and then it's power that corrupts, and because we're allowing this type of segregation of power and materialism, eventually, surely it's going to corrupt, and it's surely going to kind of have that display. Would that be something that is somewhat accurate?
Well, I'm probably not well versed in that field to comment on that. Yeah. But certainly in terms of class forces that are active, there is an exploiting class and there is an exploited class. Mm-hmm. And of course those classes clash. What's really good for the exploiter is really bad for the exploited. So, I really wouldn't want to venture a very unsophisticated response to.
No, it's good, Larry. It's the thing about knowledge is that, especially objective or let's say the application of truthful or meaningful knowledge, is that no matter where it comes from, there's always a subjective lens to it. So if I have an understanding and I'm going to communicate, it's going to come with my subjective lens to it. So usually if you want to refer as something as meaningful, objective information, it's the different lenses that work. So please don't shy away from giving me your perspective on it, because it'll be important from your lens, from your subjective lens as a peace, as the president of the Canadian Peace Congress. The idea of classes, I want to just, because a part of what I'd like to do culturally is also connect the dots and connect the cultural gaps and help maybe form a greater understanding. Because if there is any hope for peace, I tend to agree with the sentiment of of Einstein, Albert Einstein, when he says that peace is can only be accomplished via understanding, and so class is interesting because if we look, for example, back in history in India and Buddhism, Buddhism as a bridging human temple ideology bridged the class problems within India because India fell into this desperate and very rigid class system. So Buddhism came and it kind of bridged because it didn't matter which class you came from, you could join the Buddhist movement, and it created this blend for society, and it created some motion because is it accurate to say when society falls into a rigid class problem, then the clash is surely going to happen, right? It's not supposed to be like that, is it? Is it built to produce very rigid class systems, or are we supposed to have a little bit more motion and life within organizational structures per se, right?
Well, again, I really don't know anything about Buddhism, but what at least from our perspective, you know, there have always been classes of some form, and there's always been a struggle between those classes. So, for example, in ancient history, there were slave owners and there were slaves.
That's right.
Those two were diametrically opposed, and there was a clash there. There was that just automatically happens. The slaves will clash with the slave owners, the peasants with the feudal lords, and in the more modern sense, the working class with the capitalist ruling class. So, and it does tend to, at least it does tend to be that when there is this idea of all the classes getting along, that tends to come from the ruling class. And the classes all getting along really just means that the subordinate classes do what they're told. So
interesting. So where does the labor movement, because that is certainly a movement of class as well, right? I mean, would labor be classified as a class in society, right?
There is a working class.
That's right.
That's the class I belong to. Probably that's the class you belong to too.
That's right.
So
how did the labor movement make changes historically from your participation in it, right? Like how effective were you?
I mean, I'm part of the labor movement, but I can speak to some specifics in our particular struggle. This is a little bit different from the peace movement, but when I was I studied in Winnipeg, and when I was working in Winnipeg, I was part of the nurses' union. When I moved to Ontario, the hospital I got a job in didn't have a union. And actually, when I first got there, one of the first questions I have is, who do I speak to join the union? And the nurses there said, well, we don't need a union. The hospital looks after us. And coming from Winnipeg, I'd never, ever heard that before. So there was this idea that we could all just get along. The hospital would look after the nursing staff. But 3 years later, the hospital had a downsizing, and they laid off the 50 most senior nurses. So all of a sudden, the light came on that, in fact, the hospital is not looking after the nurses. So we created a union to defend the rights of the nurses. And so, I mean, I can't speak for the entire labor movement, but there was an example of, the working class getting together to defend its interests.
So organization is key, because from a construct of a company, or from even a country, any construct like that's already working in some capacity, there is the problem of capital and distribution of capital. There's a problem of vision, and there's a problem of who's in charge of that vision and how they seek to implement it, right? But it seems that at certain point, the organization and the well-being of people, there seems to be a gap that's growing, which leads to the organization of labor. At least is how I see it, right? And so, but it's an interesting point you make, because not so long ago, very recent, and before all the wars, and we are going to get to the place where we talk about everything that's happening today in the world, but I want to link it because all these issues, in my opinions, are linked together. Not so long ago, everybody also had a very negative kind of perspective on the notion of unions, or that union it just kind of a stalemate. There's no need for it anymore. Everything is going well, and which led to kind of the, I don't want to say collapse, but truthfully, the union movement globally has suffered. I've heard even in the United States that some of the unions and because some of them were armed unions in the United States, as long as I understand it properly, also find it to be problematic, or they regret giving up their right to arms as unionized organizations in the United States, for example. And so now this problem all of a sudden is up on the front. It has surfaced again, and the value of unions and organizations is coming back to light, right?
Well, I don't have any knowledge of those situations in the U.S. But I do know that the level of unionization in the U.S. has dropped significantly. But that has really been the result of this neoliberal economic policy that came in, I would say, around the time of Thatcher and Reagan, where...
What's the year?
Well, I'm going to say in around the late 80s. And there was this idea that capital was going to really flex its muscle. And there was roughly around this time is when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So there was a period of time after the Second World War, where there was a kind of what is often referred to as a welfare state, where the unions had a significant amount of strength, capital had a certain amount of strength, and there was a kind of an equilibrium. The workers could get certain benefits. That's when things like public education became stronger and stronger. Public health care came in. And there was a certain improvement in the standard of living of the working class. But with this neoliberal, I would say, onslaught that came in when the Soviet Union disbanded, and that the gains of the working class in the Soviet Union were so immense that once the Soviet Union disbanded, then there was no need for the West to keep up, to maintain the same level of working class improvement. And so with this neoliberal capital movement, the situation of workers deteriorated, at first slowly and then accelerated to where we are today, where, workers are really struggling with cost of living, with just trying to make ends meet. It's becoming more and more difficult. So there was this period where capital had a tremendous amount of power. Workers were during this neoliberal period gradually beaten down, and now that's coming back. So workers are far more active. And I think, and I'm not an expert in the labor movement, but I think, for example, last year there was far more effort on the working class to at least sort of recapture some of the living standards that they have been losing over the past decade or so.
Interesting. So there is a perception that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that many had, and I think that is under the neoliberal ideas, that now things are well because it's kind of taking peace for granted. It's kind of taking the placement of being the most powerful in the world for granted. That is all that is needed. It's from some education that I've learned or I educate myself on empires, or on the expansion of empires. It seems that when expansion is happening, the notion of abundance is available, and everybody is happy to spend more money because they seem to have some sort of notion for stability. But when empire shows up, it's usually when it's meeting fierce resistance or it's meeting regression. That's when there's less fluidity of capital that is trickling. And then we see the kind of problems that we see within the social infrastructure, especially because the empire is trying to support and supplement these wars on the outskirts of empire. Meanwhile, in the heart of empire, all the programs begin to collapse. So I think this is a good point to bring us to this point of history. Do you think that we're seeing that kind of notion of empire regression, less capital to go around for social infrastructure, and definitely a strong interest from someone in society or a class in society to maintain the notion of expansion and wars?
Well, I'd like to really focus on that period around 1990, when, I don't know if you are familiar with a term that was used back then, but with the disbanding of the Soviet Union, the phrase "the end of history" was used.
That's right.
And it was this idea that now capital had won this struggle against socialism, and now history was going to go in a certain direction. There was also an idea that there might be, with only one superpower left in the world, there might be some sort of a peace dividend. But that quickly evaporated. I don't know if you remember I don't remember his first name, but his family name was Baker. What Baker said to the leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, when Gorbachev agreed to the reunification of Germany. He said, Baker said that NATO would not expand 1 inch east of the German border. And so there was this idea that with one superpower, there would be peace. But of course, that never happened. And what you see instead of that is this movement on the part of U.S. imperialism towards what they refer to themselves as full spectrum dominance. And what does that mean? Well, that means in terms of, there were about 5 factors that I put my fingers on. So one was the economy, one was military, one was technology, one was information or propaganda, and one was a kind of a psychological dominance. So in that period in the 90s, early 90s, the U.S. had full spectrum dominance in all of those areas. But that has gradually changed as other countries have managed to get back on their feet and expand and improve. So in particular, for example, right after the Soviet Union collapsed, the standard of living in that area just dropped immediately. Life expectancy dropped by 10 years for people there. And there was immense poverty
This is where again?
in the former Soviet Union, in those different countries. So following this period, gradually the Russian Federation rebuilt itself. China has always been developing and was getting stronger and stronger. And other countries, India and numerous other countries, Brazil, there's several of them. But economically, these countries started to develop, get on their feet. And so today, we find that the U.S. empire does not have full spectrum dominance anymore. It remains dominant in terms of the military capacity, It's still the biggest military in the world. And it still has a significant advantage in terms of propaganda, especially in North America, Western Europe. But they don't have an economic advantage anymore. In fact, the U.S. economy is in trouble. Their gross domestic, their national debt is greater than 100% of their gross domestic product. They don't have a technological advantage anymore. There's many countries, for example, China, but others who have rapidly developed their technological capacity. And I was reading somewhere that the Chinese education system puts out more engineers in a year than the U.S. does in a decade. So in terms of military and in terms of propaganda, the U.S. remains dominant. But in terms of technology, in terms of economics, and in terms of psychological sway around the world, the U.S. no longer has full spectrum dominance. Yeah. So we're getting into a situation where the wars that the United States and NATO are involved in are a reaction to this loss of full spectrum dominance.
Interesting term, end of history, seems to apply again. End of history is even a term from old history. You know, when I say religious history, simply old history versus modern history. It's actually something that why they've written the Bible, to try to explain the major shifts that are happening, because usually what we see is at a certain time of dominance, there is also a dominant human temple, and people occupy that, right? And in our modern sense here, I would say that would be the new neoliberal temple. It seems that if you fall outside that spectrum, it wasn't even allowed, and everybody did not like it if you were traditional, or they wanted you to be in a certain mold, and that's the neoliberal. And I'd like to understand the difference between it and traditional liberalism and libertarian ideas. But regardless, it seems that the end of history is happening again. And this time, the human temple, the neoliberal, is effectively collapsing, and something new has to emerge, because this is kind of also the reason why we're seeing so many people reaching a state of giving up, of quitting on themselves, quitting on life, because what ends up happening when an ideology collapses or a human temple collapses, they find no way out anymore. There's no light at the end of the tunnel per se. But I think this term applies today to the American dominance, is that end of history kind of idea to the American dominance. But interestingly also, I think it seems that foreign policy is something that people don't pay enough attention to, because foreign policy is written by certain people in power or certain educated people supposed to be doing a very particular job. And in terms of suggestion that the American dominance is going to be eternal is somewhat insane, because even from a secular point of view, from a point of view of education and knowledge, we should be preparing for the possibility of not being militarily dominant in the world. But to just take that for granted, it's almost like we bridge this borderline of insanity, because we don't have a guarantee that I'm saying we because we are North America and we seem to fall under this American dominant world, right? We don't really have any guarantee that the Americans or this machine, a war machine, one has the technological advantage. We don't have that guarantee, and nobody can make it. And we don't have the guarantee that they will be superior power or elsewise, right? And usually that's where diplomacy comes in. That's where, because we should be exercising all of these paths as well. So we don't have to wake up to a rude awakening per se, right? That, oh, we were not the dominant force, we were not, and we were simply insanely arrogant, and that is a major problem today. And it's kind of like, I want to ask you about this idea of foreign policy. Who's responsible? I mean, we supposedly live under a democracy. And what if this foreign policy fails? Would somebody be held accountable for it, for example? You know, our politicians or our political leaders and teams, you know?
Well, I do want to go back to the idea of the end of history, because the person, I think the name is Fukuyama or something like that. It was a Japanese name who made that statement. But this is a very minor figure in this debate. I think a better way of looking at that is what a philosopher back in the 19th century said, that that the history of humankind is the history of class struggle. It is that struggle between these classes that eventually, that all of history comes out of that. That's the motor that drives history. So in my mind, history is an ongoing struggle between different classes. But in terms of the foreign policy and where is that going? You know, in Canada, for example, from a Canadian Peace Congress perspective, what our analysis is that Canadian foreign policy is made in Washington. In 1949, on I believe it was March the 28th, 1949, the Canadian Parliament passed a law which has often been referred to as the Atlantic War Pact. It's not the official name, but that's what we refer to it as. So that was on March the 28th of 1949. On April the 4th, 1 week later, NATO was created and Canada joined NATO. And from that date, Canadian foreign policy is basically made in Washington. And so overt is this process that Jake Sullivan, one of the high-ranking officials in the American government, a real pro-war person, he attended the Liberal cabinet meeting in Halifax before this current session of Parliament. So here you have a high-ranking official in the United States visiting and attending a cabinet meeting of the Liberal Party prior to the next legislative session.
The Canadian Liberal Party.
Yeah, the Canadian Liberal Party. So this is what is often referred to as the special relationship Canada has with the U.S. And that special relationship is a relation of more or less a very subservient situation for Canada. The Canadian foreign policy is made in Washington, and it is reinforced by our participation in NATO. And this is one of the objectives of the Canadian Peace Congress, is to get Canada out of NATO and for Canada to have an independent foreign policy based in particular on peace, on solidarity, on peaceful coexistence with other nations. It is our opinion that people have a right to live in peace. It is our opinion that nations have a right to peaceful coexistence. And that is impossible as long as Canada is in NATO. So that's one of our primary focus of the Canadian Peace Congress, is to get Canada out of NATO.
Someone might say that it would be insanity for Canada to go against the will of the United States because they border us, and it is within our interest to be in this relationship. However, they don't extend the same courtesy to the Ukrainians having the borders with the Russians, because it's interesting. I think in the core, it comes down to the belief that there is something called humanity. So when I say the Ukrainians, as human beings, have all the capacity to find ways to keep the balance between Russia and also the West and interest, and find a place for them to exist in that capacity, and find a place where they can have self-interest as well as serving the other two interests. But that was not allowed for the Ukrainians, and this war ignited.
Well, I would argue that it's not in Canada's interest to be in NATO. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you some examples. So, for example, in Canada, we have a very serious housing crisis. In Canada, we have a deteriorating medical system. Mm-hmm. More and more privatization is coming in. In Canada, our educational system is under severe threat of privatization, and the quality of the education system is going down. We have an environmental crisis in Canada. We have situations with our First Nations which are intolerable. Like some First Nations don't even have clean drinking water. So if you realize that because Canada is tied to NATO, the amount of money that should be spent on people and people's needs is sucked out of that sector and forced into the military-industrial complex. About 10 years ago, actually less than that, probably 7 years ago, the Canadian war budget, and I don't use the term defense budget because it's not a defense budget, it's a war budget. The Canadian war budget was $20 billion a year. This year, it was $36.7 billion. And the Canadian war minister, I don't use the term defense minister, the Canadian Minister of War, Bill Blair, said at the last NATO convention, if you want to call it, the last NATO summit in July, said that a 70% increase in military spending for Canada was not enough. So if you can imagine somebody who's saying that we have to spend more and more and more money on weapons just because we're tied to NATO and we're tied to foreign policy made in Washington, you can see that this is against the interest of the people of Canada. So, what is in the interest of of the people of Canada is an independent foreign policy where that foreign policy is made in Canada, and if and we can have a struggle over that, over what that foreign policy will be, but right now it is locked into place by NATO.
There's no conversation even happening about the subject,
There is a conversation. Jake Sullivan comes to the cabinet meeting and he tells the Liberals what they're going to do.
That's not a conversation, though.
Well, it's a conversation in the sense that he's giving orders to the Liberal government, and they're saying yes, sir, yes, sir.
See, I like to tie dots, and I like to bridge cultural, knowledge aspects, etc. But I think at the core here again is principle for humanity, because we're coming now to a place of history where, let's talk about privatization of education or privatization of healthcare. I mean, in the bottom of that, or in the core of that, that is to say that only those with capital are able to afford healthcare, and only those with capital are able to afford education. Meaning that education now is not a global or a universal concept that every human being should have access to. So this is a fundamental human value that I think we're breaking here, right?
Well, I have a little different view of the term capital because, some people have a slightly better wage than others, and some people can afford a little bit more of this or that. But the vast majority of the population do not have capital in the sense of capital being a factory or, some form of, independent wealth. Yes. So in a formal sense, it's not that people have, there are some people who do have capital, but we're really talking about a small percentage of the population that actually has capital. The banks, the big car manufacturer. This is where, the mines, etc. This is where the capital exists. But, there are some people who, like, for example, I was a registered nurse. I had a unionized position. I had a union wage. I would not refer to that as being capital. I would just, it's some disposable income that I had after all the bills. But, getting back to the question of privatization, the drive to privatization is a drive for private ownership of the healthcare system, of the education system, which enables the owners of that to accumulate more capital. And so this is specifically against the interest of the vast majority of the people in this country.
Specifically against the interest of the human being. We're taking something that has nobility in the core of it, like healthcare, caring for others. It's got care right in it. And then we're taking something like education, also something that should be a human value, and we're really segregating who can get access to this thing and who cannot get access to. And okay, so this
Can I comment there?
Yes, please.
Because I think that's a very important way of looking at it. You have to really wonder about the humanity of the people that are in charge of the genocide in Palestine, or look at what happened in the destruction of Yugoslavia. Look at what happened in Libya, the destruction of a country that had the highest standard of living in Africa. And now they have open slave markets. Yeah. So these people are, technically speaking, humans, but they do not have the understanding of humanity that the vast majority of the population does.
That's right. I really like the direction of this conversation. Just so you know, we're about probably 40 minutes here. Are we about 45 minutes?
Quarter to 6.
Okay, so 5 minutes, 7 minutes? Okay, I'll keep it short. I think it's a good place to end because the aspect of humanity, right? And the idea behind humanity. I think there is an element of supremacy in all of this, a human being who finds themselves to be supreme to others in one capacity or another. But, with the state of Israel and Palestine and the genocide, I think the problem is core fundamentals. So even if we're saying this is they keep using this term, this is the Jewish state, Judaism is fundamentals, is core human fundamentals. And so this aspect that somehow capital is giving some power to somebody with a sense of supremacy to exercise something on other human beings goes against the fundamental humanity of Judaism. So this is a problem there. But even in our life here, everybody used to the term socialism as if it's a different control system or the mob mentality or whatever they like to add to it. But I think in the core here, the problem is fundamental humanity, fundamental human concept that we're losing because of the sense of supremacy, not because some human being isn't capable of educating themselves and rising up but in a sense it's actually the sense of supremacy or power and capital that is creating this imbalance in our societies and taking everybody down a drain, including this foreign policy of constant war. So the last, I want to end this with I wanted to ask you about the arts and
I want to say something about, the struggle in Palestine. I want to really emphasize that this is not an anti-Semitic struggle. Mm-hmm. There is a big difference between opposing Zionism and anti-Semitism. There are unbelievable large numbers of Jewish people who are on the side of the Palestinians, and it is because fundamentally Zionism is a form of fascism. Mm-hmm. And Jewish people, especially the younger generation, are really, in the forefront of the struggle against Zionism and going back to some of the core beliefs. When Zionism was first introduced to the Jewish population in Eastern Europe, the Jewish people didn't want anything to do with this concept, and it was when the Zionist project combined with the British imperialists that this ideology began to develop. And basically, the British imperialists, first of all, wanted they were anti-Semitic because they really didn't want Jews in England, so they wanted to find a place to put the Jews, and so it was a combination. Basically, this is a personal opinion now, of an anti-Semitic Zionist ideology with an anti-Semitic British imperialist ideology that came together to create this. I will say a monster that we're dealing with.
Amplified with fascism and the Holocaust.
Well, I mean, the Nazi Holocaust against the Jewish people, that was very real. That happened. That was, this is something that we have to deal with. But who was carrying out this attack? This was not carried out by Palestinians. This was carried out by Christians in Europe. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that this was all Christians, but what I am saying very clearly is that the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the Palestinian world were not perpetrators of this. And in fact, there's a tremendous history of Jewish people seeking refuge in Arab countries from not only the Nazis, but even prior to that, persecution of various Christian faiths against the Jewish people. So,
which in the core is imperialism in Europe. But
well, the linking up of imperialism and fascism is something we have to recognize today.
Mm-hmm. I'm very honored to have you in my house, Mr. Larry, and I really think that we should have more conversations, and there's so much that we can talk about. Thank you so much for coming to Regina and for honoring us with all the invaluable knowledge. Peace is this easy. I come from a different place. I live here. It's very easy to talk to a human being in a human way, and it seems that there is no issues between humanity. I want to amplify the sense of humanity in all that you're doing and all that we're doing, and I hope that we can work deeper as we go forward.
The whole purpose of this tour is to mobilize for peace. It's because I want to be very honest, the peace movement is not strong enough today. Martin Luther King said that people who love peace have to learn to organize better than people who love war. So that is what we are trying to do. We are trying to build the peace movement. In particular, we're trying to build the anti-imperialist peace movement through the Peace Congress. That's our primary objective, but that's not our only objective. Our other objective is to build the broadest, most powerful peace movement possible that will be able to stop these wars, be able to promote diplomacy, and have some dialogue to end these different wars. And we didn't talk about Ukraine. We didn't talk about China. We didn't talk a lot about many serious problems that the world is facing. So, if you can convince the Regina Peace Council to get me back here, I'll be happy to come back.
We'll try to fundraise together for that one. Yeah. Well, Larry, we can also do many things online and have more conversations. I look forward to applying everything that we do in the arts culturally. I think we have a very important part to play as well. And is peace everybody's business?
It is, and in particular, it's the business of the vast majority of the population. There are some people who make a killing out of weapons, and they are never going to be in favor of peace. But If you ask anyone, any ordinary person in Canada, if they want to live in a state of war or a state of peace, they will tell you they want to live in peace. People have a right to live in peace. We are here to mobilize for that.
100%. Thank you again, Larry. And I look forward to everything that is to come. And definitely, peace is everybody's business. At least the human ones, eh?
Let's build the peace movement together.
We will, surely will. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We'll
Thank
have more
you.
conversation in the future. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you in another conversation.